Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Climate Change in the Ocean, Actions and Insight. My name is Helen Liu, and I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Carey Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Carey Library Foundation, whose support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. This program is made possible by the Carey Library in partnership with Lexington Climate Action Network, LexCan. If you have any questions, please post them to the Q&A. Lisbeth Bornhofft will be your host and moderator for tonight's program. Lisbeth is a climate activist and an artist with a particular passion for the bluest part of the planet. For 25 years, she served as a senior educator at the New England Aquarium, focusing on the interpretation of complex topics, including overfishing, biodiversity, and climate change. Lisbeth helped to develop a national network, NNOCCI, encouraging positive solutions regarding climate change and the marine environment. As a founding member of the Lexington Climate Action Network, she has continued to be deeply involved in communicating climate change issues to increase awareness and action. Lisbeth, welcome. I am now going to hand the evening off to you to host and introduce our special guests for the evening.
Okay, I hope that's visible to everybody. As a representative of the Lexington Climate Action Network, I'd like to just state that the purpose of LexCan, as we call it, is to educate our community about the urgency of addressing climate change and also to advocate for environmentally sustainable, equitable policies while acting in collaboration with others like you to promote bold solutions that protect living systems. We like to say, educate, advocate, collaborate. And right now, we have several committees working on programs, advocacy, communication about climate change, and much more. So check out our website. Tonight, I feel really privileged to be among so many of you who know much more about the ocean and climate than I do, especially Liz Cunningham and Les Kaufman. So I hope we can all learn from each other. What we're going to do is each do a short presentation, and then we'll have time for conversation and questions. So please remember to put your questions in the Q&A. I tried to think of an iconic animal to introduce our discussion of climate change and the ocean. And strangely, polar bears did not immediately spring to mind. I thought of another animal that's equally helpless to defend itself against the ravages of climate change, but it's largely unknown. It's small, ranging in size from a grain of sand to a paperclip. It plays a critical role in oceanic food webs, providing food for an immense range of animals of all sizes, from krill to salmon, birds, and whales. And yet most people have never heard of them. This is where they live. It's not the deep, dark ocean. Do you see the arrow pointing to a small dot in the middle? All life that has ever lived, as far as we know, occurred on this dot. All knowledge, all history, all experiences happen here. And this is the home of my ambassadors today, the pteropods. And guess what? Maybe you've already guessed, it's our home too. This view of our tiny planet floating in space is probably more recognizable than the one I showed you earlier. We celebrate our blue planet's complex and vibrant ecosystems, life-sustaining services, calming effects, and of course, the unimaginable diversity, much of which has not yet been discovered, especially in the ocean, and even more so in the deep ocean. The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, and it defines our small blue planet more than anything, and it's full of pteropods. Throughout our oceans, my climate ambassadors, the pteropods, float in liquid space. They are minute planktonic snails. Some species have shells, and scientists have studied the shell thickness of pteropods from all around the world. The research provides a way to understand the effects of ocean acidification a process triggered, as you may know, by rampant CO2 emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. The result is a reaction that changes the chemistry of the ocean and causes what we call osteoporosis of the sea. You may have heard that as the ocean becomes more acidic, animals with shells have difficulty building and maintaining their shells. The energy they use combating that acidification inhibits their ability to grow. It inhibits their ability to forage, to find food, and to reproduce. In other words, it inhibits their ability to live. Pteropods are also, I should say, important in the sequestration of carbon when, for instance, they die and their carbon-based shells sink to the bottom. Strangely, the same day the pteropods sprang to my mind, I chatted with one of our speakers tonight, Liz Cunningham, and I told her I wanted to mention pteropods in my introduction. I asked her if she knew about them. And there was a long, I don't know, maybe stunned silence at the other end of the line. Not only, I think I hear her laughing, not only did she know about pteropods, but she is devoting a significant portion of her next book to them. Liz sent me an article that she'd written about pteropods and about her experience with pteropod enthusiast and researcher Amy Moss, who I'm grateful to, by the way, for providing me with the pteropod images for this slideshow. It turned out that Liz and I had both previously connected with Amy through our work. In her article, Liz says of her encounter with pteropods, truths are truths. You know something, you believe it, evidence shows it, but sometimes an experience comes along that drives the truth home with a strength that leaves your awareness irreversibly changed. And now on to our speakers. In my world, Les Kaufman and Liz Cunningham do not need introduction, but let me just give you a flavor of who they are. Les has a rare ability for a scientist, especially an award-winning scientist with an international reputation in the conservation of aquatic ecosystems. What's rare about him is that he's uncommonly adept at communicating his message so the rest of us, including children, as maybe you could guess from some of his early work that I have pictured here. So the rest of us can understand and be inspired to action. That's how he communicates. Les has worked for decades through his research and as a professor of biology at Boston University to improve the public understanding of the effects of climate change, especially as it relates to ocean biosystems. But he doesn't stop with just analyzing the problems and talking about them. He's invested his expertise globally in the development of highly innovative programs to restore ecosystems. He recognizes the serious fact that the world's ocean has been transformed by us, and yet he teaches us to maintain a sense of humor amidst the turmoil of the climate crisis. And if we're lucky, maybe he will even mention his passion for carnivorous plants. Liz Cunningham, you can read about her on her website, in the write-up for this event, or in the personal account that emerges in her inspirational book, Ocean Country. If you do read about her, you'll discover that she is an award-winning author, a passionate ocean conservationist, and a resolute survivor. LexCan's friend, Bill McKibben, who's an author, environmentalist, and activist you probably know, and I might also add a Lexington High School graduate, he says, this book comes as a great gift, an overwhelming reminder of the ocean planet on which we live, with its great wonders and the risks it faces. I am convinced that the world needs to hear more from Liz Cunningham. And what better time than right now? I'm going to end and stop my share and toss the screen to Liz.
Thank you, Lisbeth. It's great to be here with you guys. And Lisbeth, I especially want to thank you for inviting me. And it's just fantastic also to be here with less. And I want to thank everybody at the Cary Library for putting this together. And I think that, before I begin, I'm going to speak for about 8 or 10 minutes. I just want to pause for a minute and say how deeply aware I am how much the pandemic has affected everyone. And I think a lot of us just feel like we've been hit by a 2x4 and it just keeps happening. And it's hard to stay motivated. It's hard to stay hopeful. And I just want to say that I, as well, I find it a big struggle to work in this environment. And I have a lot of empathy for folks out there who are also struggling. And one thing that I've been thinking about a whole lot during this whole period is the words of Václav Havel, who said that hope is an orientation of the heart. And for me right now, that means that it's not just what we protect ourselves from, but it's what we turn towards that's important. And in this time that's so difficult, I can't say enough how much I'm reminding myself and trying to put out the message. It's so important to keep reaching out and to keep connecting with each other in any way that we can. So with all that said, I'm really excited to tell you about something that I find very important, a great way to do something for the ocean and also to counter climate change, and that is to do something for wetlands. And the way I discovered this and became such a huge advocate for it is it came in 2 aha moments. And the first aha moment came to me when I was diving in the Mediterranean. And it was this really, really beautiful, clear fall day. And you get those in New England too, where it's just calm and everything is kind of clear and quiet. And I was diving underwater in a seagrass meadow. And suddenly I look around and I see this tiny fizz coming up from the seagrass. And I was like, holy cow, that's oxygen. And I turn around quietly, not to make a lot of ripples in the water, and it's everywhere. And I can just see it streaming. So, I mean, that experience for me, suddenly I was like, I could see, I could never see a geranium on a fire escape again the same way, because all of a sudden you're actually seeing the oxygen come out of a plant. And then in the next moment, I had this piece of information in my mind that had been there for a long time. And that piece of information is this, that over half the oxygen in every breath that you take comes from marine plants and algae in the ocean. Over half, that's every other breath. And I was there hovering in the water, looking at this, and I had my scuba diving equipment on. So my breath was like very loud. And when you're underwater, you're very aware of your breath because you've got a limited amount of oxygen. So all these things came together and I was absolutely riveted by the seagrass. And then I also knew, well, it's not just seagrass meadows. It's not just mangroves that produce oxygen. It's also these tiny marine cyanobacteria. There's these tiny, tiny little microorganisms. This is actually Prochorococcus. And it's estimated that these cyanobacteria may actually produce as much as 20% of the oxygen produced by the ocean. And this is a distribution map for them. And you can see the different colors represent the different types of cyanobacteria. And so, and also the other thing I just have to throw in about this for Lisbeth, these large swathes of cyanobacteria, they're called the pastures of the sea. And guess who feeds there? The pteropods. This is where all the tiny animals that are at the base of the food chain, like copepods and pteropods, all those zooplankton are feeding in these pastures of the sea. So when I put all this together with the seagrass meadows and the mangroves and the kelp forests, all of a sudden I'm realizing in a very, very vivid way that whether you're at the base camp of Everest or you're on Cape Cod or you're in the Sahara Desert, your very life breath is tethered to the ocean. The other aha moment wasn't so easy. This is a coral reef in the Turks and Caicos Island. I saw this reef in 1 week's time turn into this. This is coral bleaching. It's caused by pollution, by warming seas and overfishing. And this reef had been struggling for decades, but then there was a 2-degree spike in the North Atlantic and in the Caribbean. And that was it. It pushed this reef over the edge. And this happened, I saw this happen in 2 or 3 days' time. And it was so different to see it with my own eyes. And it was such a hard moment for me. I was so full of grief and fear, so much fear about the future. But it also set me on the path for searching for solutions. And that took me back to the seagrass, the thing that I was so riveted by, because they are a very powerful counter to climate change. So the big thing about wetlands is, well, they not only do they produce a lot of oxygen, but they also are very powerful carbon sinks. They sequester an enormous amount of carbon. So we were joking before the program began. I was using the term whopping big. And so what whopping big means a whole lot. And a whole lot of carbon, here's an example of it. 1 square meter of seagrass sequesters more carbon than 1 square meter of Amazon rainforest. And seagrass is part of what's called blue carbon. And that's the carbon that's stored in coastal and marine ecosystems. So it's kelp, seagrass, mangroves, and all the carbon in marine organisms, from cyanobacteria to pteropods to blue whales. And so it turns out that not only the quantity of oxygen that's generated in the ocean is amazing, the quantity of carbon that is sequestered in the ocean is amazing. So think for a minute and think, well, gee, how much carbon does the ocean actually sequester? What portion of the carbon cycle? Is it 25%, 50%? So the answer is 83%. The ocean is the largest carbon sink in the world. And then if you look at blue carbon, you look at coastal habitats, right? Well, they only cover 2% of the ocean. And yet 50% of all the carbon sequestered in ocean sediments, that happens in wetlands. That happens in those coastal areas. So, okay, you got these numbers, you have this equation. What does it mean? And what it means is we have a huge opportunity. If we save wetlands, if we restore them, we are doing a whole bunch to counter climate change. And there are areas that are accessible to us, they're actionable. And the other thing about these habitats is that if you save them or if you restore them, there are all kinds of other fantastic benefits. So in addition to sequestering carbon, wetlands are their habitat for birds, juvenile fish. The wetlands filter water, they make it more habitable. They protect coastlines from storms. They actually counter ocean acidification on a local basis. They bring the actual acidity down by 30%. And they also provide us with these great places to go picnic and go jogging and just go outdoors and be in nature. So if you live near a lake or a river or near the ocean, wetlands are a great opportunity to get involved with restoration efforts or education efforts. It's a great way to roll up your sleeves and get involved. These are some folks that these are volunteers that are planting seagrass in Tampa Bay in Florida. But I have to tell you, I'm giving this nice little pep talk here about wetlands and how we can all roll up our sleeves and do what we can. And at the same time, I have to say, especially with the pandemic and all the changes that we're seeing in the world, I know, like many of us, I often feel exhausted and I feel worried about the future. And one of the things that I do when I do feel that way is that I remind myself that our actions are part of what I like to call a bucket chain, a connected effort. All these different things that you do for the world can come together to create a better future. But the one thing about this bucket chain, when you look at it, you think, well, it's hard to act without hope. You still need that orientation of the heart. You still need that compass to move you forward. And I mean, these days, if you ask me, you said, Liz, is there hope for this world? I mean, it is such a dizzying, loaded question. So what I'd suggest is, ask a different question. Ask, who is the hope? And if you ask that question, who is the hope? Then I have an answer. Hope is people. It's people connecting and working together and giving each other strength. And that's how habitats get saved. That's how endangered species get saved. But it is something that we do need to keep reminding ourselves, to keep those linkages between people going, form new ones, keep reaching out, and keep looking for the role that you can play doing something that you love, which is also contributing to creating a better future. And as I look at this, especially in the times that we live, I'm all the more aware that these kinds of bucket chains need democracy to succeed. Because what drives these bucket chains is a currency of caring about something. It's the currency of compassion, and it's also the currency of justice. If we want to care for our Earth, we also need to care for our democracy. This is a restored wetland in Iceland that I had a chance to visit. And yes, it was restored by collaboration of many, many people. And when I look at this picture, I'm reminded that even though we're all feeling the disruption of the pandemic, that bucket chain is still there. And helping out with wetlands is a great way to help the ocean and to do something about climate change. And before I wrap up, I just want to mention that 2 great programs that you can get involved with and be a volunteer. And one of them is Mass Audubon, and the other is the Nature Conservancy. And just in wrapping things up, there was one other thing that I wanted to pass on to you. The other day, I went for a walk with a friend, and we were talking, and she described the pandemic this way. She said, the pandemic is like this. Just when we need each other most, we're separated. And her words reminded me that we need to keep looking for opportunities to come together, keep looking for ways to do something that we love to do that takes us into a better future. And with that, I'm now going to pass you on to the fantastic Les Kaufman.
Hi, everybody. I don't know about the fantastic part, but that is my name. I'm glad that Liz filled you with hope, because what I'd like to talk about is chaos. A synonym of chaos is complexity, and it's not the enemy, it's actually our friend, but it does require that we fully understand and embrace it to make change in the world. And I'd like to begin by pointing out that even though it has become commonplace to refer to climate change as global warming, because it does involve an elevation of the average temperature of the surface of the Earth and the ocean, it's really a whole bunch of things that result from excess carbon dioxide and methane and other gases in the atmosphere. Warming is one of them. Sea level rise is another. The declining pH or increasing acidity of the ocean is a third. And the powering up of historical violent storms is a fourth. And these operate together to change the ocean in unexpected ways. And the impact of climate change is so multifarious and complicated that really the best thing to do is just turn off the greenhouse gases rather than trying to solve each of these problems individually. Now, global climate change is superimposed on other things that people are doing to the coastal ocean. And the combination is just a horrible ball of twine. We are destroying habitat, we are pouring pollutants into the ocean, and we're removing biomass, including critical elements of the ocean ecosystem that enable it to function and sustain itself. Now, I want to tell you 2 quick stories, one about Stellwagen Bank and the Gulf of Maine. Stellwagen Bank is a national marine sanctuary. I don't know how many of you have been whale watching, but that's usually where you go if you leave from Boston, Gloucester, or Cape Cod. And the National Marine Sanctuary, which occupies much of Massachusetts Bay, is a multi-purpose gold mine for people who make their livelihoods out there, seek inspiration by following whales, bird watch, go fishing, treasure maritime heritage, sunken ships and things like that. And all of these different uses are not always totally compatible. So the sanctuary is kind of a lens, a microscope for figuring out how all of these human activities can be compatible. But the problem is rendered even more complex, more challenging by the fact that the Gulf of Maine, in which the sanctuary is situated, is warming faster than any other body of water of this type on the planet. That makes us very special in a macabre way. We are kind of ground zero for dealing with the impacts of climate change on the ocean, even though living on land, we're at one of the lowest risks for climate change disruption. So really, the whole climate change debacle is focused in New England on the Gulf of Maine. These red areas are areas where over this period of time, the average temperature of the ocean surface was above, up to 5 degrees centigrade above what you would expect for this part of the world. Now, this has brought about profound change. If you look at the three pictures on the left, this is part of the food web of the Gulf of Maine in its original state, the state of 30 or 40 years ago. And the animal at the top is a copepod, a tiny little relative of the lobster called Calanus finmarchicus. And this copepod, one of many, many species of copepods, is one of the biggest and the richest in terms of the oil and fat that it lays down. So it is a critical part of the food web and part of the answer to why the Gulf of Maine and northern and southern waters in general is so productive. The next fish down is a forage fish. It's called a sand lance. Forage animals are sort of the middle, the crux of the food web. They're the things that the things we eat. So sand lance is a critical part of the Gulf of Maine community, sort of a central bus transferring materials and energy from the phytoplankton to the calanus, from the calanus to cod. And that's a cod in the lower left. Now, all of these animals are dependent upon the bursts of production that come with cold, nutrient-rich waters brought south into the Gulf of Maine by the Labrador Current. As fresh water seeps out from the north with the melting glaciers, and as the Gulf of Maine warms, less and less of this cold water is reaching the Gulf of Maine, and the productivity is dropping, and the species composition is changing. Cold water animals are moving further north, including lobster, cod, and other animals we care about. Warm water animals are moving up from the south. Cod is being replaced by black sea bass. Sand lance by things like menhaden and butterfish. And copepods, big juicy ones like calanus, are having their place taken by smaller ones, a little bit less nutritious, like this Centropages. Now, as a result, our fisheries change, our wildlife changes. Basically, the whole place is rewritten. It gets a new script and not necessarily one that we would favor. One of the other issues here is that these critical middle of the food web critters, these forage fishes, which aren't all fishes, are used for so many different things and function in so many different ways in the system. And we also harvest them. We take large amounts of herring and squid and shrimp, and that removes some of the gears, some of the mechanism of the system, and causes it to change. So the combination of climate change and us tinkering with things and sucking biomass out creates an unprecedented situation, giving rise to new kinds of communities that are difficult to predict. One example of the knock-on effects is the impact of losing sand lance, a school in the upper left, which are a primary food for humpback whales, which are the main animals supporting the $50 to $100 million a year whale watch industry in the Commonwealth alone. And any of you who have been whale watching know that some days you really need to take your Dramamine, because if the sand lance have moved offshore, the whales move offshore, which means you have to travel farther to see them. And that has a significant economic impact. Now, sand lance are going to be dropping out of the system, and moving in will be animals that have a different behavior, that don't come so close to shore. And the whale watch industry will have to pay heed. Whales will also have to feed differently as their food in the water column begins to diminish. Bubble net feeding, which you can see in this picture on the lower left, will give rise to feeding on the bottom. And you can see in this trace that David Wiley made of a whale's feeding behavior, bubble net feeding at the top and bottom feeding at the bottom. And if a whale's feeding on the bottom, it's not much fun to look at it from a boat. The other thing is that the distribution of the whales will shift. These are the banks off of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and southern Maine. These are the places where productivity is maximal. And this is where you go to whale watch, or fish for that matter, either commercially or recreationally, or bird watch, or do anything else that requires seeking the wildlife out. And these areas where the whales now gather will shift as the water in the Gulf of Maine warms to areas further north, probably up by Browns Bank, or even further north, still further offshore. So our coastal economy is literally running away from us. Now, I want to take a quick switch to the tropics, to coral reefs, which are honestly my favorite community. I work on the Gulf of Maine largely because Boston University pays me to be up here, but at every opportunity I head south. And one of the things that's happened during my lifetime as a coral reef biologist is we've been losing the coral reefs. By losing, I mean that they change into a different kind of community, as Liz showed us a moment ago, from hard corals to algae, basically, to seaweed. These pictures, which were created by industrial light and magic, because when we showed people photographs, they didn't believe them. So we thought we'd show them cartoons because they're more credible. Here you can see the rich fauna that once occurred around a Bahamian coral reef, groupers, parrotfish, sea urchins, keeping the reef healthy, and living staghorn and elkhorn coral. And since 1960, you look at this same reef today, this is what you would see on the right. But if you take the data, this is only going up to 2002. Since 2002, the percent live coral cover on Caribbean reefs has taken another dive, almost hitting the 0 point. So we are losing the coral reefs in the Caribbean entirely. They are turning into a totally different kind of community. And nowhere is this as serious as in Florida. If you look at the upper left, that's a picture of what was a gorgeous coral reef very close to Miami, with elkhorn coral now standing dead like a ghost, and massive boulder corals now pockmarked with what I was calling Siderastria psoriasis. This is a coral called Siderastria. And we don't even know what causes this disease yet. The elkhorn coral was killed by bleaching, as Liz had described, and by a disease called white band disease. Again, we don't even know what the causal organisms are or the process associated with it. But the long and the short of it is, as the water warms up, not only do corals expel their symbiotic algae, but they become highly vulnerable to disease. And the disease-causing organisms are reproducing more quickly because the water is warmer. And the best example of this is the coral in the inset, which is a brain coral that has been afflicted with a horrible plague called stony coral tissue loss disease that erupted near the sewer outfall of the city of Miami in 2014 and is now racing across the Caribbean, killing at least 21 species of these massive boulder corals. Now, it isn't all bad news. I'd like to talk just for a minute in closing about what we can do on a small scale to keep reefs viable, to kind of save all the pieces and keep them in suspension, so that as we address the root causes of climate change, coastal pollution, and overfishing, there is an opportunity for nature to reset itself and to spring forth from the small areas that we have gardened, repopulating the world with healthy coral reefs again. These are pictures from the Coral Restoration Foundation in Florida, which pioneered some of these restoration techniques. You have to think about it in a systems way. The colony, the community, the whole reef down here on the upper left, and the venua. Venua is a Polynesian word that means literally the land, but is actually a symbolic word encompassing all of nature, including people. We have to think about the ecosystem with us in it in order to behave responsibly on behalf of our children and grandchildren. Now, just one other example of how complex this system can be and how much we have to know to be good stewards. At the upper left is elkhorn coral with clouds of copper sweeper fish swimming through it. Much of that coral was killed by the combination of white band and bleaching, and you see it now has turned pink. That pink is another reef builder called crustose coralline algae, and it can survive in the wake of these bleaching and disease events. But unlike the coral, its skeleton is made of another form of limestone that is very easily dissolved. So the ace in the hole, the finger in the dike, these coral and algae that can help coral reefs to regenerate, to reboot after the corals die, that organism has an Achilles heel that is hit by another effect of climate change, ocean acidification. The same thing can be seen in the lower photographs. This is lettuce coral that builds huge mounds in Belize. Here it is after a bleaching event, and you can see that the pink coralline algae has covered over the area, resetting the reef to regenerate very quickly. But if acidification speeds up, this repair system will be lost. Now, there are amazing people out there pioneering this restoration and coral reef stewardship work. And I just want to shout out one of them, Lisa Karn, who's in Belize, who runs an organization called Fragments of Hope that we've been working with for the last 10 years. This is a poster advertising this. She has a huge education campaign. Lisa travels around the Caribbean explaining her work. This is one of our rearing tables in the lower left, where staghorn coral put out as tiny little pieces has over 1 year grown to this size. And then Lisa puts it out on the reef, it grows, it covers the reef, and within months, all of these fishes are there living in the coral. It's just astounding. You can see the 10 years of regeneration at Belize's premier aquatic park, Laughing Bird Key National Park, beginning in December 2010 with the first coral outplants and culminating in this picture taken in 2020 of the reef virtually 100% covered with living coral. Now there's a little bit of a twist here. These are fast-growing branching corals. The massive corals have been killed by stony coral tissue loss disease, and the resilience of the reef relies on our being able to bring them back. But the point is, we can repair small areas of coral reef and kind of hold the fort while we solve the climate change problem on a global scale by reducing the release of greenhouse gases. And if we do this effectively, there is hope that we can accelerate the recovery of these systems so that our grandchildren can see them once again. Now, there is another project called Mission Iconic Reefs in Florida, led by NOAA, that I'm a part of. And what we've set ourselves to do is take 7 of the shallow patch reefs that are the most important for tourism and fisheries along the Florida Keys and bring them back to life. There is less than 2% live coral cover on most of Florida's reef today. There had been 50 to 80% when I was an undergraduate student and I first dove there. So we're going to try in these 7 small areas in a carefully designed experiment to focus the full institutional effort of South Florida to raise coral for outplanting and direct all of it into these 7 places and see if we can hold the line against the impact of climate change in these places. We've calculated how many corals we need. We have targets for percent cover and for fish community recovery. It's a giant experiment. We'll see if we can pull it off. Now, there's tremendous hope in these promising pilot projects, but unless we do something to curtail the roots of climate change, all of this will be pissing in the wind. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Les, and thanks, Liz. I think what I'm getting from this, you've demonstrated to me that, and I knew this anyway, I think we all know it in heart that the best way to move forward is to funnel all of our actions and our interests and our passions, move forward as collaborators. And I think by doing that, that's when we're going to create this tidal wave that we really need, of not just understanding, but of solutions.
Yeah, Lisbeth, someone just mentioned Dave Vaughan, who had been with Mote Marine Lab. I forgot to bring it. Dave led the world in producing a book that goes into much greater detail than I could just now. And I recommend the book on coral restoration that's available on Amazon. Vaughan as the editor.
Oh, good. All right. Well, I see that that's been put in the chat and lots of people are asking questions. One thing that's come up, and it was actually something I was hoping that you two could delve into a little bit more, is this whole idea of the carbon cycle and how it impacts ocean systems. And maybe even a little more basic, what is carbon sequestration and what is blue carbon? I read some just the other day after our discussion about whales and how they contribute to this. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
I'm looking at Liz.
She can't tell you're looking at her.
Actually, this is a perfect thing because I'll do the overview and then Les can fill in the deep scientific details. So that will be good for me to go first. So then I won't be stuck with an apple in my mouth. Blue carbon, when you're talking about plants, it's actually just like terrestrial plants. The carbon goes into the soil. And the cool part about, say, seagrass or mangrove is that if you grow a forest, you say, oh, wow, look, we're sequestering a whole bunch of carbon. But then if you chop that tree down and burn it, that carbon is then going to be released back into the atmosphere. So the fantastic thing about wetlands and coastal blue carbon, coastal plants, is they are sucking that carbon down year after year after year, and it's staying there. And same thing for all the organisms in the ocean whose bodies are made of carbon, like our bodies are made of carbon. So when all those tiny little pteropods have their funeral and then they get their burial at sea and they're headed down into the depths, they're taking carbon with them. And the same with fish, manta rays, whales. That is all blue carbon that's going down to the bottom of the ocean and it stays there.
Yeah. I am seeing so many good questions here that, if I may, I would like to depart from blue carbon and sequestration for one moment.
It's all yours, Les.
All right, so this is the toughest question, and it has to do with an inspiring story from Hawaii about an activist named Renee Umberger, who has battled against the aquarium trade in Hawaii. on the grounds that it was damaging Hawaii's natural heritage. Now, the world is full of well-intentioned people who are doing their part to make the world a better place, and particularly make the ocean a better place, but they don't all agree. Renee works with a guy named Snorkel Bob, who has a snorkel renting company, and together they have decided to target the aquarium trade in Hawaii. Now, it is true that there are unscrupulous collectors raping the reef, sending fish off to home hobbyists who often don't know how to take care of them. That's all true, but that's a minority. We did a study, or we funded actually a study, I can't take credit, to see if the conservation measures for the most important aquarium export from Hawaii, the yellow tang, a beautiful lemon yellow fish, were those conservation efforts working on the big island of Hawaii? And they were working perfectly well. There were large protected areas. The fish spawning in those areas were repopulating the areas where collecting was allowed. And there was not a significant diminution of the yellow tang population as long as things were properly regulated. So here's the question, who's right? Is it right to stop a livelihood that is supporting not that many, but some, both Kama'aina, native Hawaiian, as well as expats, in the interest of the natural heritage? Or is it really doing significant damage? Or put differently, when you have this science, do you believe it? Do you go by it? Or do you go with your heart? Even if your heart may be wrong. That's my Renee Umberger story.
Well, I'll chime in on one little bit about that. You know, at one point I had these two goldfish named Glasgow and Ying Mei. And I tell you, they taught me more about water quality than anything I've read. So, you know, there's something to be said about that. And right now I'm writing about deoxygenation. And I'll tell you, when my water got too warm, the goldfish go to the top of the tank and they start gasping for air. And I learned so much observing and taking care of those fish. So I do think you have to weigh, you know, what's the value of people learning about fish and learning about taking care of water and versus the negative value. So I will throw that into the pot. I mean, that's another piece of it, is the education value.
Yeah, and one more thing. There is something that needs to happen in Hawaii. We need to go back to the traditional Vanua, or in Hawaiian, Honua-based system of managing land and water. There are signs all over Oahu saying you are in this or that management zone. The management zones are called Ohupua'a, which means where the pigs run, because pigs don't like to go over volcanic ridges. And so the native Hawaiians figured out a long time ago that the natural unit of function for people is a watershed and the adjacent coastal ocean. And that within that hierarchical unit, you need to be very careful how you behave. If Hawaii went back to the traditional system, something like catching aquarium fish would be a negligible concern.
It's all about the balance, isn't it? And I agree with you, Les, that sometimes we put our emotions ahead of the science. There are a lot of programs. So you and I were a party to some at the New England Aquarium, like Project Piaba. I think that the motto for that is buy a fish and save a tree. By saving the livelihoods of the ornamental fish people, the people who are catching fish for the aquarium trade, by saving them and helping them to catch their fish sustainably, then they weren't going to go and chop down the rainforest, which would have caused a whole lot more damage. But you do have to wonder, when too many fish are taken, how is that impacting not just that species, but that reef? And then on a bigger scale, when they are impacted by something like climate change,
Right.
How is that they're going to be less able to withstand those bigger threats that they have?
Well,
And Oh,
No,
let's
no,
go ahead.
Liz. No, no.
Oh, I'll
no.
just jump in very quickly and just say that's a great segue to community-based conservation, which is the idea that you are in your conservation efforts. You're also thinking of the communities of where that conservation occurs and trying to blend the well-being of the community with the well-being of the ecosystem. And I think that's a great example of that.
Yeah, and I don't want to be an apologist for the aquarium industry. It raises a darker question. Can we trust each other? For example, I've been an advocate of pilot experiments to figure out if ocean aquaculture of finfish could be done in a sustainable way. We don't know the answer to that question yet. In Sarasota, where I had a home for a while, one of these projects was proposed 80 miles offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. It was just a pilot experiment, but nobody in Sarasota trusted that that's all it would be. They thought that the company would just take off and without any more than a rubber stamp, ruin the Gulf of Mexico, never mind what's coming down the Mississippi River. But that's a real issue. Do we trust each other?
And what's your answer to that? And how does that, and in terms of climate change, there's an awful lot of trust that's missing. One thing that I heard recently was two people arguing about geoengineering. That question came up in our question and answers here from one of our participants. What do you think about that? What do you think about putting iron in the ocean or other, I don't want to use the word extreme, but that's how I think of it a little bit, extreme measures to counteract what we've already done?
Well, oh, Les, would you like to go or should
No,
go?
I went Liz.
Oh. Well, I have I'm like of two minds of this. There might come a time where you need to take a certain measure, but most of these ideas are untested. So they haven't been tested on a broad-based scale. And I do actually agree with Michael Mann, who talks about geoengineering as being climate methadone, because it's like, okay, it's funny, but it's not funny. It's like, okay, we'll fix it for a year or two, and then what? We'll dump stuff in the atmosphere, sort of mimic a volcano. It'll cool the earth off a little bit, but then what happens 5 years from now? And meanwhile, you have all the fallout from that measure. And the same thing with putting iron in the ocean. The story for me about geoengineering is we already have proven technologies and social and cultural practices to not only bring emissions down, but eventually reverse climate change. We just need the political and moral will to do it. And one of the programs that I really want to draw attention to is Project Drawdown, which is a peer-reviewed scientific study of the top 100 technologies and social and cultural practices that actually can bring emissions down, and then by calculations, eventually, towards the end of the century, even start to reverse climate change. So geoengineering is there, it's an option, but we already have lots of fantastic ones. We just need the moral and political will to implement them.
Well, you might have answered a question that came up relating to this, as if geoengineering isn't really something we should be centering on as a solution. Then what do you two think will bring the greatest shift in preventing further disruption to the ocean because of climate change?
Stop.
So you mentioned political will.
Yeah, like the best thing to do is stop changing the climate. We need to stop pouring greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, both carbon dioxide and methane. This is what we were supposedly doing in Glasgow. It takes enormous political pressure. What I will say is we're here in the United States. I don't know if any people are watching from overseas, but the United States can clean up its own act and have the greatest potential influence on the rest of the world in that manner. We don't need to tell other people what to do. We need to demonstrate what to do.
Well, and Liz, you talk about unleashing the passion for rescue. Do you think that will get some of these people who are not really on the bandwagon in terms of cutting our carbon emissions? Do you think that will help get them on the right path?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a mix of storytelling and helping people to get connected to these things so they realize it's not far away. It's not far away in time. I think part of it is communication, but I also do think that there is something to be said to sort of unleash the passion for rescue. And I think one of the things, I just recently reread Angela Duckworth's Grit. And in the chapter on hope, she talked about learned helplessness. And I think we want to do the opposite of learned helplessness. And that is to really, for everybody to find something that they really love, that they really care about, whether it's birds or whether it's wetlands or it's the open ocean, or whether it's a lake or a river or a little beach near them, and find some way to engage that love of that place or of working with people to doing something that's bettering the world. And I think when you do that, when you think about what do I love, what do I care about, what do I love to do, that to me unleashes the passion for rescue, because then you have this feeling. I mean, I certainly had it when I saw the coral reef bleach. I thought, my God, what am I going to do with my life? And so I think those are definitely opportunities to unleash that kind of energy. And then I also say I was in this very, very interesting long conversation when I once spoke in Prague, and there was this very astute professor, and he said something very interesting about education. And he said that if you engage a student in a life-saving exercise, so maybe they're doing rescue breathing in a swimming pool, and you engage them in a situation where they have to employ the passion for rescue and do something that seems almost impossible, and then they're able to do it successfully. He said, it doesn't matter if they ever help another swimmer again in their life. They've just had that moment. They've had that kind of sentiment unleashed in them. And I think it's the same thing with political activism. I think it's the same thing when people train with the Red Cross. It's just finding that pathway in yourself to take action.
Well, Les, you've had lots of students, so you've probably seen that in action. And we have a question from a student saying, I'm learning about ecological marine units in my GIS class. Can you guys speak on this? I know nothing about that. I bet you do, Les. And I bet you've seen lots of students sort of find that niche that Liz is talking about, that spark that sends them off in the right direction.
Yeah, we've been trying to understand how to view patterns of ecosystem dynamics in the ocean instead of seeing it as one giant, homogeneous morass. Can we see it as regions that function in a particular way? And the short answer is yeah, of course, duh. But there aren't really lines in the ocean that say here you're in this system and here you're in that one. They're all connected. It's just a way to better understand things. I was privileged over the past, I forget how many years, to be part of a team-taught course on climate change at Boston University that was developed for the Honors College. The professors included a historian, an English lit English lit professor, and then a botanist who works on climate change, historian, a political scientist who works on the military and climate change, and me. And we tried to help the students take a positive, action-oriented perspective on climate change, but they taught us more than we taught them. They showed us, first of all, that they are really scared. They are really upset about this, and it's compromising their mental health. And we had to be extremely careful how we discussed what individuals can do so that they did not feel overwhelmed, they felt empowered. And I think it's important to note that equally vexing problems have been solved before. And people really have an amazing capacity to change when necessary. We just have to avoid doing it so late in the game.
I'd like to add on that too, that I think there's sort of a knee-jerk cultural line that, oh, we're going to educate our children and then they will save the world for us. And I think that there's still a residual sense of that. And it is so profoundly unfair. And I think it's really important for people to figure out, what network am I working in? What niche can I carve out? What role can I play? And let me get in there and play that role. And one other thing I want to say about that is that I don't think it's saccharine. I think some of the most successful conservation efforts have actually happened that way. I think, Les, you'd agree, is people, they find their role, they hook up, people work as a team, and they're able to create enough linkages to actually get something done.
That's right. I mean, when people say, can one individual make a difference? It is individuals that make a difference. It is, just as Liz is saying, it's people who cultivate their passion for healing the world, bring others aboard, point them in the right direction, serve as a field marshal so that the work is as effective as possible. And that's how movements get going. It's very powerful.
And I just do want to riff on that, Les, just to carry on with that just a little bit, that, I mean, I've just recently learned this too, though, that this whole idea of a carbon footprint was actually created with a lot of guile, because it really was created by an ad agency. And the idea was to put the onus, put the responsibility on individuals and go, okay, you got to reduce your carbon imprint. But it's really a distraction from what we really need, which is political systemic change. So the idea that you as an individual, just to focus on that, I think it's really important. Again, even though we're linking up and thinking broadly, we really need to think about that larger systemic change.
Yeah.
Well, and there's right now, someone I think just posted about this in the chat. Right now, there's Mass Energize, and Lexington is involved in this. And that's really individuals in their homes making a contribution that creates a much greater impact. And the same with, I think I've seen in the last decade, a shift from people saying, oh, I'm going to help out, I'm going to do a beach cleanup, instead of now, when I think more people are saying, I'm going to go help restore this wetland by planting little nuggets of seagrass. Someone did comment, there's so many good comments and so many good questions, but someone did comment or ask, why isn't coastal ecosystem protection and restoration the top priority for reducing global climate risk and climate resilience? Well, I think we humans, it's right, what's behind you there, Liz, that's what we think of when we think of the ocean. We think of where we encounter the ocean. And so we really want to see that restored. We want to see those habitats restored. And I also think there's a lot going on with that. But what can you talk about some restoration programs that you've been involved in? You both have touched on this already.
Well, a really interesting woman that I've spoken with a lot is Kathy Boyer, who's worked on restoration programs in the San Francisco Bay. And she researched different ways of restoring wetlands. And she had, she was dangling seeds in the water and then also growing seedlings. She found that growing the seedlings and then planting them when they were young was the best way to do it. And there's a really actionable situation in the San Francisco Bay. They had a very large bill passed because basically with sea level rise, okay, what's going to happen is a lot of areas where there was landfill, that's going to become water. And so there are plans in place and there is money in place to start restoring those areas as wetlands again. So one of the things about wetlands that makes them very actionable is, well, you're going to have this problem in a lot of metropolitan areas where you're going to have water coming in where there was landfill. And well, guess what? Here you can restore the wetlands that were originally there that were filled in. So I think those kind of programs are really terrific. I know there's a lot of great work going on in Massachusetts where the Great Marsh is. There's also been money allocated for that. So there's some terrific things going on as well in Massachusetts.
Yeah, but there are some, I think, Liz, there are some things that would be good for people to keep in mind. And this goes back to the comment that Ray Andre made about Renee Umberger. The good news is nature is unbelievably resilient. The bad news is she doesn't revisit exactly what she's done before. It's always a little bit different. And that means that restoration's goal is not necessarily to turn the clock back,
Yes.
but rather to help a system reestablish itself in a manner adapted to current circumstances. So it still performs similar functions. It may not look exactly the same. And there are several elements of that. And one of them is peeling our foot off the footprint, trying to generally reduce the stress that we are placing on nature across the board. So for example, it may be safe to sample, to harvest yellow tangs for the aquarium trade, but do you really have to? I mean, as soon as you do, there's this potential conflict, at least in perception, between the goal of restoring the reef and the goal of having this livelihood. Well, these fish can be bred in captivity now. It's no longer necessary to take them from the wild. So by having a symbiotic relationship between the livelihood and the system, so that they support each other instead of always being at odds, we can do that.
And I think I also want to mention, with that, I think we've all done it on Facebook, the so-called doom scrolling. And there's just a natural human tendency to either go towards a saccharine hope, wishful thinking, or apocalypse. And definitely a lot of what you get in the news is very much apocalyptic thinking. But I think, Les, you would agree with the science that every degree that we limit warming, every degree that we do, that's more habitats saved,
Right.
That's more creatures saved. So it's really about moving the needle. And there is this tendency just to, again, what a lot of people are saying, the new denial, the new climate denial is despair and saying, oh, we just can't do anything about it. It's all going to go to hell. And the fact is, there's a ton that we can do.
Yeah, this reminds me of Paul Simon's song, Kodachrome. I mean, there's a whole spectrum between a color photograph with rich colors that really pop and a black and white photograph. You can be anywhere in the middle. And the closer you are to color, if color is what you want, that's better. It's not like a sudden threshold. So anything you do that's good is better than not doing anything.
Yeah, and I think that, this there, I mean, certainly it's so much really difficult, grim, disturbing news. But, most of the people that I know in the conservation field, absolutely, they definitely struggle with despair about the world. But if you ask them, is their job rewarding? Do they love what they do? Of course. So it's a very rewarding path to get involved and do what you can and see the results that you get. And I think it's a lot more rewarding than standing back and saying, my God, I don't think there's anything we can do. And I think most of my colleagues would agree that, the path of engaging the issues and seeing how much you can move the needle, that's a rewarding path. And there's a lot of joy and a lot of enjoyment there.
Also science can help us get wherever we want to go, as long as it doesn't violate the laws of thermodynamics. But knowing where to go is a matter of values. The single most important thing here is that we share and cultivate values that are adaptive, that help us lead more sustainable and richer lives and pass a world full of that wealth on to our children. So you can have, it's okay to have faith in the scientific method and our amazing ability to solve technical problems. But if we don't have a compass heading to begin with, it's all for naught.
Les and Liz, when it must have been 30 years ago, so I won't remember the quote exactly. But when I first got into this back in the early 90s, I think I was most inspired at first by Ross Gelbspan's book, the heat is on.
Hmm.
And I remember hearing him speak once. It was mostly adults and it was mostly people with white hair. But there was a middle school student in the crowd, and he stood up and he said, well, what's going to happen to me? I mean, that wasn't his exact question, but basically he was saying, well, what does this mean for me? You guys aren't going to be here. And what am I going to do in the future? And Ross's response to him was really interesting. It's kind of what you're saying. It's about values. He's saying, well, you're going to be less interested in how big your house is or what kind of car you drive. You're going to be more interested in the people you know and your relationships with them. And I thought that was very telling. I hope it comes true, but it's hard. It's hard sometimes to, as I'm sure everyone on this tonight realizes, it's hard to feel that sense of urgency, but also stay optimistic and avoid magical thinking, which I think is a word I've heard you use, Les. Because many people believe things aren't so bad and technology is going to save us, but meanwhile, others think we're just about to careen off of a cliff, or we may be somewhere in between.
Yeah, it's important that people understand the agency we have at our disposal. Carl Sagan wrote a book, The Dragons of Eden, that captured a lot of the thoughts that we're seeing now with this huge anti-science thing that's going on. I think it's critical that people understand what science can and can't do, and the critical role of community and the arts in motivating people, in enshrining and communicating their values, that all of that is of a piece. And not to go down, be led down a path into a dark woods of, magical thinking, of thinking on the basis of false assumptions about living blindfolded. That's not fulfilling our potential.
Yeah, and I'd like to just throw in too, like very often, people say to me, what can I do for the ocean? What one thing can I do for the ocean? And I'm always,
what do you say to them?
Yeah, I'm always dumbfounded because, and there's always one thing that I always think of, and I always feel like do what you love, because so say people consider, me and Lisbeth, you and Les, we do things for the ocean, and yet I couldn't write without music. I just couldn't do it. I listen to music all the time that I write. So God forbid the musicians don't make music. So I do think you do have to just find what really calls to you, and then, okay, find a way to connect that to climate change, to the oceans, to our future. But it is so important to really do what you love and, find the thing that's really yanking your chain, that thing out there that's really calling to you that you feel like you need to do.
Well, looking at the clock and seeing that it's almost 8:15, and I'm hoping that you two have some final questions for each other or words for our audience about the ocean. And I'm not sure that it's the first thing people think of when they think of climate. And I think there's a lot going on in the ocean that we just plain don't know about as a culture, but even as scientists, we have so much more to learn. So what do you want to leave us with? Or do you have a question for each other?
I would like to ask if it's a good idea for each of us to spend more time with someone we love or care for that thinks magically, and just at least help them understand why we think differently. That, if you drop something, it will fall to the ground. That's replicable. Gravity is real, and all these other things we're talking about are real too. It shouldn't be a political debate. The key is to draw a line between apolitical things that are not opinions, but are demonstrable facts. And then this other world that we've created as humans, which is full of opinions and perspectives and feelings and all of that, none of which is bad. I wonder if we could do a better job of it. I mean, I have two acquaintances, actually back to the aquarium industry. For some reason, I do not understand. I've mentioned this to you guys. I work in East Africa on fish that are very pretty. And so I have kind of a fan club of aquarists, and I'm an aquarist myself. And I was horrified to learn, at first horrified, that more than half of the people that were kind of, hearing my stories of Africa were politically right-wing and against masks and didn't believe in climate change. And I mean, like on and on and on. I just couldn't, it was like I just drank poison or something. I didn't understand it, but these were people I really cared for. And I found that, well, coffee or beer helps, but I found that spending time with them and hearing them out and having discussions with them instead of fights can really move the needle, both needles, mine and theirs. And it's a worthy expenditure of time, not on Facebook.
Oh, don't get off of Facebook, because then I'm not going to see your carnivorous plants anymore.
Oh yeah, my carnivorous plants. Yeah, yeah. Everyone has to have like an Addams Family side to them, and
Yes,
that's
yes,
mine.
I do too.
Oh, what's yours?
Oh, all those biofacts in the basement.
I see. Liz, yours?
Oh, you mean my odd habitat, my odd habits?
Your darkest side.
I have a demi-tasse spoon collection.
Oh, that is.
That doesn't seem terribly threatening.
It is, because it's getting large. It's
Yeah.
That's like an oxymoron, isn't it? A large demi-tasse spoon.
There's one thing I think I'd just share, just in urging other people. I'll just share a little bit of what drives me. And it's, I would say, quite honestly, it's hard to do without breaking into tears. But there are moments where I've been underwater with a manta ray or a whale or a school of fish, and the level of passion and care and love that I feel. I always know, when I'm leaving the ocean, I always just feel like I won't betray you. I will do what I can. And that's what drives me. And I really encourage people to find something that makes them feel that way. Because your battery is rechargeable.
I think my one thing that makes me feel that way might be listening right now. Hi, Carter. So yeah, my grandson. I think what keeps me inspired right now too, other than that, is that I think back to those early 90s when all I was trying to do is get people to understand that the rays of the sun came in through the atmosphere and they bounced up and they all of that and all the charts and graphs. Now people are talking a lot more about solutions. And what's even more important? I think more people are listening. So that's kind of what's inspiring me now, is that I'm hearing the solutions and I'm seeing people who are listening. So what Les is saying is that we need to get more people to listen to us. And there are over 100 people listening right now. So maybe some of those will join us.
Yeah, Elizabeth, not just listen, but come with us.
Yes, join.
I love to take people into the ocean. I love teaching underwater. And I love showing them how to do things that have nothing to do with why they're underwater with me, like how to meditate underwater or how to fall asleep underwater, which I hope dive safety officers aren't listening to me. But I mean, immersing yourself in a natural experience and clearing your mind is a very good way to feel that passion that Liz was talking about. And I don't mean it in a wooey way.
We get you.
What?
We get you.
Yeah, okay. Just to be able to relax.
Yeah. Well, thank you, folks. I'm going to share my screen again and wrap up with something that that Liz and I talked a little bit about. I don't know if you can see it, but first I just want to thank you, because together, as I said, you've really demonstrated how we can move forward on this together. But I want to end by thinking forward and envisioning our blue planet as a place that's full of the vibrant and abundant biodiversity of life we all cherish, just like what you showed us in some of your photographs. And we also want to consider what we've just been talking about a little bit more, and that's our part in bringing this vision to life. There's so much that we can do that it just becomes really overwhelming to move forward. But I'm going to just suggest 3 things we can do to kind of keep us all in the game. Imagine many of you, and I know a lot of you, are forging ahead on this. Whoops, I just went way back for some reason. Hold on. Things skipped way ahead. I'm not sure how that happened. I'm just going to go really quickly through like this. There we go. So the first thing is to continue to learn, just both on your own and with others. Check out some of the links. There are a lot of links provided in the chat tonight, and that might help motivate and inspire you, or maybe give you an idea of who you can contact. Sign up for a newsletter that interests you. You can find lots of resources on lexcan.org. Second, we talked about this too, talk and ask questions. Have more conversations with the people in your life about what you learned here tonight, what you learn when you read or listen, and then look for opportunities to explore those critical topics with people in a positive, non-confrontational way. And finally, join. What Les was saying, be part of that solution story, reach out to an individual or an organization that you respect, someone who's working in this arena, and ask them to guide you. If you're already working in this arena, reach out to someone, as Les suggested too, who's not really thinking this way right now. We all have special skills and passions that can help turn this tide of climate change. A friend recently told me we're all in the same boat. We just have different paddles. And that's what Liz was talking about too, about finding our own niche. So in the end, this is a very small planet, and everything we do individually and together, as we discussed, to address the effects of rampant climate change on the ocean, is ultimately in our own best interest. On behalf of the Lexington Climate Action Network, I want to thank our speakers, Liz Cunningham and Les Kaufman, and our sponsor, Perry Memorial Library, especially their programming and partnerships manager, Helen Liu, who started us off tonight. And maybe even more, thanks to our audience. I hope you feel very deeply connected to all life in the oceans, and that you understand how climate is inextricably linked to the ocean. We hope that you're going to teach people to see an expanse of ocean like this one I have on the screen, and think of the pteropods. But also think about how the immense, diverse collection of species, including us, as Les pointed out, is connected to all the complex ecosystems in which we all exist. And then think about how what we do in our communities, our very own communities, is connected to the fate of all life on our small blue planet. Thanks for joining us.